On this wild and wonderful Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, Donovan Clingan already out of the reach of the Memphis Grizzlies. We'll talk about that first up. Then we're going to take a look at some of the other guys on the roster, non-Jaren Jackson Jr. edition. Check in, see if they have any chance of being here when the team is good again. And we'll preview Grizzlies Bucks tonight as Memphis closes out a road trip. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, our wonderful friends out there in the podcastosphere, however you're taking in the show, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever the case might be. Hopefully you are in a good mood, you're in a good place, and you're excited to check out another episode of Locked On Grizzlies with your co-hosts. It's always good when I'm able to say that. Joe Mullinax, joined by the award-winning, I've been slipping the last couple of times. I haven't been giving you the props part. The award-winning Damichael, the commercial appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. I, of course, of Locked On Grizzlies Focus now, did write a wonderful piece about Marc Gasol, or at least I thought it was wonderful. Pat myself on the back a little bit. Thanks to everybody.
I read it.
Did you? Did you like it?
I enjoyed it.
There you go.
I really did enjoy it, Joe.
Nice.
I was telling you before the show about your experience with Mark. I'm kind of like a little not jealous because I'm happy for you. You're one of the people who get to shine during this moment right now. Like this is your time.
Yeah.
To shine.
Yeah, they didn't reach out to me for the documentary, which hurt my feelings a little bit. But no, I'm just kidding. It was fun to write, like I talked about on yesterday's show, and I'm sure we'll talk more about Mark towards the end of the week. Going into the retirement on Saturday, that sort of stuff. So thanks to everybody that shouted out the piece, talked about it, checked it out on Parker Fleming's Subsocolitis. I always risk it all with that pronunciation, but I think I nailed it. I've practiced.
Yeah,
so
you got it.
Thank you to Parker for having me, and thanks to everybody for checking it out. And thank you for being here and checking out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Again, we are free and available wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, whatever the case might be. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing, becoming an everydayer. We had a couple of folks in the comments yesterday on YouTube talk about being an everydayer, wondering when the episode was going to drop, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's all good. And we appreciate people being like, oh, we need our Locked On Grizzly fix. So thanks to everybody for checking in on us and doing that. We got it done. And, Damichael and I are very grateful that we have a wonderful audience out there waiting as everydayers to check out the show. Every day, Damichael, I go to Tankathon, and I'm not necessarily proud to admit that because, I have a wife and I have children.
I don't think anyone who is surprised to hear that Joe Mullinax goes to Tankathon.
I have a life, and I know it seems like I don't, as being a blog boy essentially for the last 11 years or so. But I go to Tankathon every day, and I do a simulation, and I check out the mock drafts, and on ESPN, obviously different from Tankathon, but just talking about I'm very much in the lottery mood, right? Mm-hmm. I go to check out a mock draft, and you and I talked about this a little bit. Mm-hmm. My boy, Donovan Clingan, who you and I have had debates about on this show. One of the few things that we disagree on in terms of I would have taken Clingan at 7.
Yeah. Yep. And
you are not as big of a fan of that idea, or at least you weren't, right?
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had this conversation since the tournament's really begun, or since Clingan has risen up the ranks, dominating Illinois and doing the things that he's done in the tournament. In the ESPN latest mock draft, they have him going in the top 5. And that would most likely mean that Memphis would have to trade up to acquire a Donovan Clingan. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind with this, and I know you're going to go a little more in depth here, partner. One, the tournament can always blind you to an extent.
We talked about it before the tournament.
The true value of these guys. There's a larger sample size, a larger scope. And again, I think we had a pretty good conversation, even though we didn't agree. He's a lottery pick. I think at this stage, that's pretty certain. But there's a difference between pick 10 or pick 12, pick 7, and then pick number 3, right? And obviously, it kind of depends on how the lottery shakes out. But for example, if Memphis were to jump up to number 2 overall somehow and it's happened before, right? That's why John Morant's in Memphis.
Morant. Mm-hmm.
If Memphis were to move up all of a sudden, I would not take Clingan 2 because I don't think there are guys that would be better options at 2. Now, some of you are listening to this and you're saying, Joe, you're a hypocrite. But Damichael, hopefully you can help me explain this.
Yeah.
There's levels, right? There's levels. If Memphis is picking where they statistically are most likely to pick, I don't know. And again, we haven't talked about it yet. I don't know if you can still say that Clingan is a reach at 7. But at the same time, I think Clingan in the top 4 would be a reach, if that makes sense. And I'm curious as to your take on that after watching him in the tournament. If you still would be on the boat of taking another wing, there's lots of those types of guys. Clingan, as of now, is really the only true big aside from Sarr. It's him and Sarr.
I still think you can still make that argument because Sarr is like a wing in a big body. Yeah.
So in terms of a true big, Clingan is the only guy that's in the lottery now. Yeah. So how do you perceive the rise of Clingan? I'll talk more about whether or not I would trade up. I think I already just said I wouldn't. But I think that there's levels to this, and maybe it validates my prior opinion that it's 7, it's not a reach anymore. But at the same time, I think we might be getting too hot on the guy. This is a player who does a lot of things well, but his perimeter game is little to
non-existent.
None. And he also has conditioning questions.
He has conditioning questions. There's a as we talked about previously, there's a medical pass.
Right.
I've heard some people say, medicals are going to be very important for him. And then there's the fouling thing, which, the Grizzlies already have Jaren Jackson Jr. So you put 2 guys in the same front court who came into the league, and Jaren to a certain degree still has those questions with the tendency to be foul prone, then put yourself in a tough spot. Steven Adams kept himself out of foul trouble for the most part. I like what I've seen in March from him, and I feel fair in saying that, Joe, I think you were onto something with this guy from the standpoint of when you said you would draft him at 7. It sounded like a reach at that point to me because of the fact that there are so many wings who have just real pop potential to me, like 18, 19 point per games guys. And I don't want to pass up on, like, I'm thinking of, if you look 4 years down the road and you see Jacoby Walter, McCullers, Rob Dillingham, Reed Shepherd, all averaging 18, 19 points for a team, and Donovan Clingan's giving you 11 points, 8 rebounds. And it's like, man, you missed out on some real stud scores. But I see the light. He's 7'2", 265. The one question that I think he checks that I had the most when we talking about getting a rookie big is, would they be ready to go against a Jokic, to go against the Embiids, to go against the Karl Anthony Towns, to bang with the Goberts in the paint, the Sabonis's of the world. From a physicality standpoint, he seems to pass that test. I wouldn't be afraid of saying, this is the guy that I'm putting my trust. Now, he's a rookie, so it's going to be a learning curve there. But over the course of a full season, giving him that experience, I wouldn't be afraid of throwing him out in that water. So I think it's fine at 7. But I'm with you. When we talk about that top 4, like, I think ESPN has him at 3 right now. So if the Grizzlies were to jump up to have the number 3 pick, I think he's in the conversation. But I think you're a little hesitant on the idea of drafting him there because of the foul prone thing. It's kind of a situational thing too, because you already have Jaren Jackson Jr. Jaren has been top 5 in fouls per game, the last pretty much every year he's been healthy in recent seasons. If you put a guy beside him who is similarly, has the tendency to foul, you're setting yourself up for a situation where Brandon Clark is going to be in conversation for 6th man of the year. So that's where I am right now. I completely agree that he's moved up from where he was. I think there are a couple opportunities here going against DJ Burns, mobile guy who has really good footwork. So from an NBA big perspective, this is going to give the scouts a good chance. How can he compete against these guys with really good footwork? And then potentially a Zach Edey matchup awaits after that. And we all know that's the ultimate test. So if he passes those 2 tests, then let's revisit this conversation, because I might say take the guy at 2, 1, whatever. But right now, I say, 7, solid. Top 3, I'm not sold yet.
We can talk more about this, obviously, as the season ends and we start more NBA draft prep. For me personally, if the pick lands in the top 4, and maybe this is my hot take for the show, I think it makes it more likely that Memphis trades it. And maybe that's incorrect, but I feel like if you call Brooklyn about Mikal Bridges and you've got the 7th overall pick, that's not as sexy as calling Brooklyn about the number 2 overall pick. Yeah. And I to me, that makes it more likely. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe you disagree and you can let me know in the comments.
No, I don't.
Yeah, no, I'm talking. Yeah, but I think it makes it more likely because I feel like this draft, and I'm just starting. I'm not an expert, but I actually do watch film and do some research. You know, Clingan's been my first guy that I've really been on, but I'll watch more. And I think that when you look at this draft, just as an overall broad stroke, I don't know how many superstars there are, but there could be a lot of Desmond Bane pseudo all-star type players. And as you like to say, partner, guys that are elite role players.
Starring in their roles, yeah.
And starring in their role. And I do think that Clingan could be that. You're exactly right about the medicals, all those other concerns. But even the minutes thing, like if he only gives 25 minutes a game and it's Brandon Clark and Jaren Jackson Jr. eating the other 24 minutes at center, you could do a heck of a lot worse. And I think that there's lots of different ways that they can address this, which we'll continue to talk about as we go through the offseason that's approaching. But I was intrigued by Clingan moving up. I would not trade up for Donovan Clingan. I wouldn't. I think if Memphis is in that 6, 7, 8 range, I'm more than comfortable. I have been this whole time taking him. If they somehow jump into the top 4, if they land number 1, it's hard to pass on Sarr, right? That guy looks pretty darn impressive. But at the same time, again, if I'm calling the Brooklyn Nets and I'm like, hey, I've got the number 1 overall pick, you guys are looking to rebuild, that would be hard to not talk about. And I think we will eventually here on Locked On Grizzlies. But before we get to the fun of the offseason and all those possibilities, we have to talk about what's happening to this Grizzlies roster right now. Them in Detroit going back and forth. It seems like swapping players at this point for who's going to have the most guys play this season and set that record. We're going to check in on the other guys, right? How they're doing, anybody that may be a long-term fit in Memphis. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die whip alive. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. Over 122 million parts for your number 1 ride or die. You will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your whip alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to United States customers. Make sure you're checking out eBay Motors today. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we will continue the conversation about the other guys. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, your co-host for this episode. Always nice to be able to say that to Damichael Cole, my co-host, award-winning, acclaimed writer over at the Commercial Appeal for the Memphis Grizzlies as their beat writer. Make sure you're checking out his work on X at Damichael C. And if you're not subscribed to the Commercial Appeal, you most certainly should be. Damichael will move on from dreams of Donovan Clingan and Sarr and all these guys that Memphis could potentially get in the NBA lottery. Even more lofty dreams of Mikal Bridges. We'll never let one go with that one, or at least I won't. Yeah. The nightmare that currently is the Memphis Grizzlies roster, no disrespect to the guys that are trying to realize NBA dreams, compete. You walk a line, and this is one of those times where what I say and what Damichael say maybe aren't aligned, because Damichael actually goes into locker rooms and talks with these guys. So I don't want to disrespect the work he does with that. But there are a lot of dudes currently on the Memphis Grizzlies roster that are not going to be on this roster and not be on an NBA roster in a month, right? That's important, at least in my opinion, to point out. But with that in mind, Damichael, again, you're around these guys. You pay attention as that beat writer, maybe even more so than I should. Maybe I should pay more attention. But again, I focus so much on Jaren Jackson Jr., Luke Kennard, Brandon Clark, the guys that are going to be around. We don't talk a lot about the end of the bench, end of the rotation players, who that is on the fringe of this rotation, this very bad rotation. Who is on the fringe of that and beyond that you actually think has a chance to be around, when training camp and then when opening night comes here in about 6 or 7 months?
Yeah, this is an important conversation to have, not just because these are the other guys who are in that conversation, but because of the way the Grizzlies roster is structured, as me and you have talked about, 10 times over at this point. But it just starts with the fact that pretty much the top 8, 9 guys or so, you can pretty much realize who those guys are. They're pretty much locked in. But then there are like 5 or 6 guys who are under contract next season, but there could be more movement. Like, we know this is going to be an interesting summer from the standpoint of a lot of movement. There are so many names, the Zaire Williams of the world, all these different guys. Are they going to solidify their spots? Derrick Rose, Yuta Watanabe has a player option. Does he pick that player option up? Does he decline it and go somewhere else where he feels like he has a better opportunity? All these things have to be considered as on the table right now. So you don't have a lot of spots, but who can separate themselves? I think let's start with the 10-day guy, Xavier Simpson. I think he's just the next guy pretty much in line to get an opportunity here. Because quite frankly, I mean, I don't know, what did you think about DeJon Jarreau, Joe? I think he should get another opportunity in the NBA some point soon. And now that he's playing with the hustle, like the Grizzlies probably should be that team. 6'7" guard, like he was impressive to me in that little bit of time.
They're just going to be out of roster spots eventually, right? Like that's
Exactly.
part of the reason we're having this conversation. If we are to assume that the Grizzlies are never going to be healthy ever again, then we might as well stop talking about them as a contender. Again, we have to project this roster to what they're going to be as a championship contender, as a top 5 team in the NBA. And maybe that's lofty, and that'll be another topic we talk about over the offseason with the way that the Western Conference has gotten so competitive, with how impressive Victor Wembanyama has been for the Spurs. It's hard to imagine San Antonio and Popovich just sitting back and saying, we're going to keep developing this thing. I could see them being super aggressive. The Rockets going on the heater they've been on. So the Western Conference is going to be tougher than ever before next season, with Memphis being added to that mix. You've got 13 teams essentially that are trying to make the playoffs.
You need hoopers.
It's just hard to see a guy like that who has played well at times, but it's been in losing efforts, and it's been at the end of a rotation that eventually is going to have Marcus Smart and Luke Kennard, not barring a trade. It's going to have more players involved who actually can stick, whether it's the end of the bench, because like John Conchar in theory is going to be an end of the bench guy.
Exactly.
And he has become a player, not as important as Jaren, obviously, but he's during this lost season, he has been significant in terms of eating minutes. He's been out due to an injury recently, but he, and everybody knows how hard I am on John Conchar, but he's eaten minutes, right? He's been able to be a part of getting through this season. And I can't value that in Dylan Brooks when he was a rookie and then, not acknowledge it with John Conchar. And that's a guy that'll probably be at the end of the bench when the team's healthy.
Yeah, you make a great point. Like at the end of the day, when this team is healthy, we're going to talk about some really tough decisions in terms of players who won't be in the rotation at some point. So with all that being said, like I think that pushes the conversation more to the two-way players. Like right now, you have Jordan Goodwin, you have Scottie Pippen Jr., you have Trey Jemison.
Yeah.
You also have 2 second-round picks. And, of course, there's probably going to be the opportunity that the Grizzlies, trade up and end up with 1 selection.
This front office has made a trade in every single NBA draft.
Yeah. And
they've been a part of.
Exactly. And the thing is right now, though, they have those 2 picks. So, in theory, I feel like you have to have that flexibility before you have those 2 picks. And right now, the way the offseason is aligning is you're probably going to need two-way spots open. I think for me, we talked about it a little bit before. Scottie Pippen is probably the safest of those 3 guys, and Jordan Goodwin is probably the least safe. I think with Jordan Goodwin, I love he gives me that grit and grind type mentality, but the things that he are good at, you have other players on the Grizzlies that are already good at him. He's a great rebounding guard. You got Vince Williams, who's a great rebounding guard. He makes a lot of hustle plays. Vince Williams does that. Marcus Smart does that. John Conchar does that. So there's some redundancy there, and he's not a really good shooter, which is something that the Grizzlies have clearly tried to pivot away from. I think he is the least safe of those options, and that clears up 1 potential second-round pick. But then the bigger question is Trey Jemison. And that's the question, whether is he someone, and that you bring back next season, or do you find value and say, hey, there are 3 centers we think in the draft who could be second round picks, who could potentially give us more than Trey Jemison did this season on 2-way deal. So those are kind of some of the conversations that have to be had when you talk about. But as far as the other guys go, Lamar Stevens is one who everyone's been watching closely. I think we've said it pretty much from the standpoint of that. I need to see more from him on the wing at this point. When he was playing the 4 and the 5, it was nice. But now that he's on the wing, you see him behind the 3-point line a little bit more. You want to see a little bit more continuity and consistency there for the Grizzlies to make that tough decision and bring him back amid all of the roster depth that they have.
He seems like a guy that is a good locker room fit. When he was traded, Boston talked about him more than I thought they would. Yeah, maybe they just really respect their guys. Like they loved Marcus Smart when he left and all those sorts of things. But at the same time, there's going to be some tough decisions to be made. And like I mentioned with John Conchar, the Grizzlies clearly value him. They wouldn't have given him the extension. They wouldn't be using him the way they do. Even if I don't value him as much as they do, they clearly do. And I do think that it's going to get tight for guys like Lamar Stevens. So how this all plays out, assuming Memphis makes some deals, maybe not the size of Marcus Smart being acquired, but, there's always an opportunity, and Memphis has the resources to move things around if they so choose. So going to be interesting to watch that play out moving forward. Let us know in the comments what other guy maybe you're the biggest fan of. Lamar Stevens has kind of been the one that I've gotten. He's a trendy one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but maybe you have somebody else that you like. Let us know in the comments below. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, going to finish up this episode previewing Grizzlies Bucks as well as we can, again, with the injury issues. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, you'll notice that Damichael and I talk calmly. I get fired up every once in a while, but I'm not yelling at Damichael. He's not yelling at me. If maybe you're tired of watching ESPN and Fox Sports all day and listening to people yell, right? Having to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day, is an option, bringing you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube as well as on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Of course, it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Make sure you're checking it out. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. It's your destination for sports, or at least it should be. From live games, highlights, in-depth analysis, they offer amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing television that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes as well as free and live TV. They recently created a Fire TV channels section to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. And again, as I just mentioned, that includes us here at Locked On and a lot of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more, keeping you up to date on things like March Madness, NBA, Major League Baseball, and so much more. Plus, great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you most certainly should. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Make sure you're checking that out as well. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, finishing out with a Grizzlies Bucks preview. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication, award-winning. Got to make sure I keep saying that. And I want to stress, I'm not saying that as a slight. I'm not being sarcastic. Every once in a while, people think I'm making fun of Damichael. Don't project your jealousy of the love and affection that I have for Damichael Cole onto me. That's not fair to me. Dear listener, dear viewer, I genuinely respect and admire Damichael for doing all he's done at this stage of his career. Don't put your insecurities on me, all right? That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to push that off to the side. Damichael knows how I feel, and that's all that matters.
That's all that matters.
Clingan, we've talked about, right? The possible rise up the draft board, what Memphis should perceive of that. We talked about the other guys, Lamar Stevens being the most sexy name out there, but there's other players that are going to log minutes in this Grizzlies-Bucks game tonight. Guys that aren't going to log minutes, John Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, they remain out. Vince Williams Jr. remains out with that knee. lots of guys still not playing. Maybe on a future episode, we can talk about Yuta Watanabe, what's going on with him. Obviously, personal reasons, that's his business, but just more so that's another guy's name that we didn't talk about really, and what his role. I think he has a player option going into next year.
Exactly.
So we'll talk more about that down the road. But looking at this game, it's the Grizzlies taking on a team that has championship aspirations. Anytime you have Giannis Antetokounmpo, obviously you have championship aspirations. Damian Lillard in tow, Chris Middleton getting back up to speed. That is a Bucks team that is very much interested in contending. How do the Grizzlies close out this road trip competitively? Now that they've beaten Detroit, it's not a winless road trip. They have the opportunity to feel a little bit good about themselves. Milwaukee should be a double-digit favorite in this game. How do the Grizzlies approach, whether Giannis plays or plays a lot, whether Dame plays a lot as the season closes? How should Memphis really try to attack this Bucks team and at least try to keep it competitive going into the final quarter?
Yeah, and that's going to be the key, right? Keeping this game competitive. I think for the most part, what we've seen from the Grizzlies is throughout these stretches, they've played solid defense, holding teams to less points than they average, holding teams to under 100 points.
Still hovering around the top 10 in the NBA, even with all the injuries.
Yeah, I think they're 11th in defensive rating right now. And like you said, with all the injuries, still upper echelon, top third of the league pretty much defense. So the number one question is, who in the world is going to play for Milwaukee? Like, that is also a team that's dealing with some, nicks and bruises there. Right. And for one, they'll be on the second night of a back-to-back, which is important to point out. And if you look at the injury report, from the first night, there are some things that stand out in terms of we don't know at this point who's going to play. Damian Lillard is out, was out in their last game on yesterday due to a right groin strain. Giannis was probable to play in that game and did play, but he was on the injury report. Chris Middleton was on the injury report, even though he was listed as probable. Pat Beverly was on the injury report, even though he was listed as probable.
Feels like they're setting us up for a second night of back-to-back.
Exactly. Yeah. The point to me is, I think that there's a very realistic chance that a lot of these guys could say, hey, it's the second night of a back-to-back. They were on the injury report the day before, and this could be the game they take off. Especially Dame Lillard is already out. Giannis we talk about hamstring and groins and things like that, soft tissue injuries. This is like you said, this is championship aspirations type team. So I want to see who they're going to have play. But if those guys play, I think there's just another opportunity for these guys. Like, I think of Lamar Stevens. Like, you remember earlier this season, he guarded Giannis, a ton in that matchup. I want to see a little bit more of that. Like, that's how he stands out as someone who could make his impact on this roster. His ability as a wing to be able to guard those type of players stands out. I want to see the Scottie Pippen Jr., right? Just coming off of a game with no points, pretty much put up a donut in 20 plus minutes. How does he respond, after a performance like that? There's going to be plenty of opportunity out there for these guys. Who takes advantage of it? Jake LaRavia is another one I want to see.
I want to see Santi Aldama. Right. And I agree with all the names that you just listed. Santi Aldama for me is a guy, because all the guys you said are probably not in the rotation next year. Santi Aldama could very well be in the rotation next year as that fourth big, if you assume Memphis addresses it somewhere else, that sort of situation. What becomes of Santi? Because Santi, if he's not in that mix, and again, you know how I love trades, Damichael.
This is a big one.
If you are dangling a 6'11", early 20s, I think how old is Santi? Like 22-ish? Like that? Early 20s still. 6'11", has shown both in FIBA and in the NBA that he can score at all three levels with shooting and range as a big. That's a guy that you tag with a salary and a couple of firsts, and maybe it's more attractive to a rebuilding team than perhaps it should be.
He's going to become an interesting name.
Yes.
He really is.
And I like Santi, and ideally, he's ideal for this team moving forward, but I think he's going to be up for contract extension talks soon as well. And as that money gets tight, you have to decide what's it worth, especially as Clark, you talked about Brandon Clark yesterday being under contract for the next few seasons. What does that mean for a guy like Santi Aldama as extensions become realistic for him? So I want to see what Santi Aldama does, not necessarily just against the Bucks, but the rest of the way, because whether it's improving his lot for trade value, whether it's showing that he's worthy of an extension, the Grizzlies are going to have some tough decisions to make with a guy that, late first round pick, Desmond Bane, obviously they had a lot of success with. It's not to the same level with Santi, but to find someone that could be a end of rotation guy for a championship.
I got a take for you on that one.
Deal. Yeah, let's hear it.
I feel like in a way, Lamar Stevens' future in Memphis is kind of tied to Santi Aldama's future.
Maybe
in Memphis because of the fact, again, when you look at Lamar Stevens, I think it's going to become very clear that he is going to have to play the 4 here. That's going to be his position. He's not going to play the 3 a lot in Memphis. So
especially with Gigi Jackson and Vince Williams Jr. moving to more complementary.
You see it. They're playing the 3. You're not playing over those dudes. He can get minutes at the 4. Taylor Jenkins loves his physicality. Newsflash: Taylor Jenkins does not love Santi Aldama's physicality. So,
if you've been watching the Grizzlies at any point during Santi's tenure, that's not surprising.
Yeah, Santi there's a reason he's not playing center much these days, despite their lack of depth at that position. So, with all that being said, I think that if you're advocating, which some people have been doing, you've been seeing it, I've been seeing it, for the people who've been advocating for keeping Lamar Stevens, I think you have to ask yourself, am I willing to give up on Santi Aldama? I don't think the Grizzlies keep both of those guys because of some potential redundancy there at the 4 position. Even though their games are completely different, I just don't see them bringing back Lamar Stevens when they can already have Santi Aldama factored into the 10-man rotation.
I think you're onto something there, and that's obviously Jake LaRavia. You can kind of argue, obviously, he's a little bit shorter than Santi, but Jake's in a similar boat in terms of being that big kind of combo forward.
Exactly.
Stevens is probably the more aggressive of the 3, but LaRavia has, again, established a larger sample of being a functional NBA end of rotation, end of bench in particular player. So lots of guys to keep an eye on still, even in a season where a lot of fans, I'm guilty of it too, being excited for it to end here soon. Still lots of chances for them to compete. And again, it's Jaren Jackson Jr. maybe puts up another 40 burger, right? That'd be cool.
Yeah.
See, depending on who plays for Milwaukee, if everybody plays, the 40 burger probably isn't happening. But if it's a skeleton crew for the Bucks on the second night of a back-to-back, that isn't that different looking from what they saw against the Pistons. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch play out moving forward. On tomorrow's episode of Locked On Grizzlies, I'll be flying solo, another game where Damichael doing his beat writer duties for the Commercial Appeal. He'll be focused on that. I'll have you solo going into our Thursday edition of the show, talking about Grizzlies Bucks, maybe taking a look at some of the names we just mentioned, seeing how they performed, that sort of stuff, looking ahead to the weekend that's coming for the Grizzlies. Joel Embiid potentially making his return over the next couple of days, that sort of stuff. Lots of different things we can talk about as we close out our week these next couple of episodes. Damichael and I will be back together for the Friday show. I'll have you solo for Thursday. Thank you so much for being with us on this Wednesday edition of the podcast. Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you catch the show. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Become an everydayer if you're not already. Check out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube, the free channels app, part of Fire TV for Amazon. Make us a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every time an episode drops. I know Damichael appreciates it. I appreciate it. We appreciate it as we continue to build Locked On Grizzlies. Until next time, he's Damichael. I'm Joe. Stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. Free and available wherever you get podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Have a good day. We'll catch you next time.